The Right Honourable, the Lord Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As Vice-Chancellor of York St John University, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Creative Centre for our first Chancellor's Lecture. Reeta Chakrabarti joined our university as Chancellor in 2019. As one of the country's most trusted broadcasters, she shares our values to advance social justice, promote fairness, and address inequalities across our society. Today, we are honoured to welcome Reeta back to campus alongside her guest speaker and fellow BBC News presenter, Ben Brown. Events such as this provide a valuable opportunity to provide enriching experiences for our students, our staff, and our wider community. And I'm delighted to have so many of you with us this evening. I hope you enjoy what promises to be a very interesting and insightful event. I would now like to welcome Reeta to introduce her first Chancellor's Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Well, it's so lovely to see so many of you here today. I feel I ought to apologise because it's taken a while to get this series of Chancellor's Lectures going. There have been a casualty of COVID, as have many things, but I can guarantee you that today will have been worth the wait, because it's a huge pleasure to me to have Ben Brown giving this the inaugural Chancellor's Lecture. He's somebody who will be known to everybody here. He's one of a handful of the most recognised and respected and admired names in broadcasting. Despite his youthful looks, he has a career that dates back 3.5 decades. He's young at heart. He's had a long career, is what I'm trying to say. And he has reported from many of the biggest global stories of recent times and many of the biggest national stories as well. I'm not going to run through everything he's done, because hopefully he'll be doing that, telling you about the stories he's done in his career, his journey through journalism, as well as giving you some insights into the decision-making in the background and the dilemmas that journalists face in the field. Ben will speak for 20 or 25 minutes, and then you will have a chance to ask questions. So the first rule of journalism is that no question is stupid. So please ask any question that you would like. And I must remember there are people up there as well, so hopefully, you know, wave very prominently, and I'll make sure that I come to you as well. So, please welcome Ben Brown.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Reeta. I'm going to stand here, but I might wander around a bit. I am very old, yes, but
I didn't say that.
As you will find out when I talk through some of the stories I've covered. Just to say, both me and Reeta were in Ukraine at different stages last year. That's our balcony position in Kyiv, which you've probably seen on BBC News quite a lot. And it was quite an extraordinary experience being there. I had actually, again, because I'm so old, I was in Ukraine when I was Moscow correspondent in 1991, and I covered Ukraine's declaration of independence. And just before the Russian invasion, the December before the invasion, I had a call from the BBC sort of idea that I would go around the streets of Ukraine. King Charles, Prince Charles sends his good wishes. Anyway, let's talk about BBC and news. And yeah, please think of questions you want to ask, because I want this to be, not just about me talking to you. I want to hear your questions. Criticisms of the BBC, criticisms of us, Reeta, me,
No.
We always like getting feedback. And in fact, I wanted to start off by asking the younger, any students here? Okay. Do any of you want to be journalists? No. How wise. And can I ask the students, do any of you watch BBC News? 3, a handful. So, you know, for our management, people like you are the holy grail, because they talk about news avoiders and people hard to reach audiences. And in these days where everybody's got so much choice, not only about what they watch on telly, but what, you know, for their time, demands on their time, social media, online, everything, digital era. So everything is changing in terms of how we get news, what news we consume. I mean, my son who's 23, when the war started in Ukraine, and he was very interested, but he got all his information from YouTube. He doesn't watch BBC News. He doesn't care what his dad does. But and he was watching videos of the war on YouTube and Twitter and stuff. And so partly I want to talk and you to think about, you know, news and how we consume it and what we can trust in this kind of crazy digital era where we're being bombarded with so much stuff from so many sources all the time. There's a kind of information overload. But how much of that information is true or accurate or gives you any context about what's happening? Can you believe it? And one of the things at the BBC we try to, I suppose, get home to people is that you can trust us. And what is trust? Why should you trust us? Why should you trust the BBC? Why should you trust me? And so I suppose by telling you a bit about my life story and my career and my background and the thought processes, that's one way to get our audiences to trust us, is to know who's broadcasting to them. Anyway, think about any questions you might want to ask about all of that. I started as a journalist in, God, what was it, 1982, so you know, just gone 40 years ago. That is how old I am. And I started at Radio Clyde in Glasgow, and I was saying to Reeta on the way over here, actually, I've made many catastrophic mistakes in my career, but of course, as a journalist, you tend to make a lot of mistakes when you're first a journalist. And I was a trainee journalist at Radio Clyde in Glasgow, and I'd never been to Glasgow. I was a posh Oxbridge graduate, ended up in Glasgow, could barely understand what anybody was saying up there. It felt like another country. And I was reading the news, and there was a fire in a street named after Jean Armour, the wife of the famous Robert Burns, the Scottish poet. And being an Oxbridge graduate, I said, there's been a fire in Jean Amour Street. Rather than, and the radio stations' phone lines went crazy, and all the people in the west of Scotland were saying, get that Sassenach off our airwaves. But in those days, of course, Radio Clyde liked to have posh southern voices because they thought it sounded like Radio 4, and even though it was an independent radio station. So that's why I got a job there. Anyway, I worked in local radio for a few years, and I ended up at the BBC in 1988. And it was this kind of extraordinary time, and I suppose that I was very lucky looking back, because it was a time, and I don't know, I mean, this is history now, and actually I was asked by my son's history teacher to go in to lecture, to talk to the school history class, because they were studying some of the stories I've covered as history. And that really does make you feel old when you think you've lived history. But actually the great privilege of being a reporter, I think, is to have seen history at first hand and to be in what we call the sort of front row of history, and not just watching it on the TV, but being there and watching events unfold. That has been the great privilege of my life, really. And when I joined the BBC in 1988, we were on the cusp of a sort of tectonic change, really, in European history, because the Berlin Wall was about to collapse in '89, Soviet communism was about to collapse, Eastern Europe and the Iron Curtain was about to collapse. And although in some ways we've gone back to that now and we've come full circle because we're in a new Cold War with Russia, but at that time it felt like the whole post-Second World War European order was changing really dramatically. And so as a young 28-year-old reporter for the BBC, I was incredibly lucky that they started sending me straight away, because in those days the newsroom was very small, much smaller than it is now. And I was sent to Eastern Europe as these momentous changes were happening. And I found myself at the Berlin Wall as it was coming down, walking around with John Simpson and thinking, wow, sort of pinching myself, thinking, I'm actually here, the Berlin Wall's coming down, and I'm here for the BBC. And so that was kind of watching history. And then I was sent to Moscow as Moscow correspondent I started going there as sort of holiday relief in the late 80s, and then full-time from 1991. And that was an extraordinary time as well, because there was the coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Soviet president, and then there was the end, as a result of that really, the end of Soviet communism. And another incredible sort of pinch-me moment was standing by the Kremlin outside in Red Square and watching the Soviet red flag of the hammer and sickle of Soviet communism being lowered over the Kremlin. And it was Christmas Day, 1991. And again, I thought, wow, watching history, very lucky. And we met, I interviewed Gorbachev, who I think was who died recently and was one of the great figures of modern history. I mean, a sort of polar opposite from Putin, when you think what an evil kind of modern day dictator, czar Putin is, whereas Gorbachev was a great liberator of Russia, really. And he was in some ways an old-fashioned communist, but at the same time he set Soviet people free. He allowed Eastern Europe to go free. He allowed the Berlin Wall to fall. So he was an incredible man. And I was lucky enough to interview him. And I took my wife, and I had a very young baby daughter then, Ella, who's now 30, but was then just a little baby. And he was fascinated by my baby daughter just before we did this interview, and he held her, and he was obviously a very busy man at the time, and all his aides were saying, "Sir, we need to go on with this interview. Can you stop sort of playing with that little baby?" Anyway, he was cradling her in his arms, and he said to his aides, "Bring me some paper." And he said, "I'm going to write her a letter." And he wrote this, "What's her name?" I said, "Ella." He said, and he wrote in Russian this 3-page letter, which we still have. And he was writing for minutes. Dear Ella, you are sleeping, but all around you there is turmoil and momentous events, and I hope you grow up. My wish is that you will grow up in a calmer, more peaceful world. And it went on. And so, again, an extraordinary sort of moment with a man of history, really. So I felt, again, very blessed to be part of that. And then when I was in Russia, I started sort of getting into covering wars and slightly addicted to covering wars. There was a very vicious war. And the Russians, when you look at what they're doing in Ukraine, they've got a big track record of being incredibly brutal in the way they wage war. And in Chechnya, which I was sent to in 1994, it was an example really of what they're doing now in Ukraine, which is just bombarding people, civilians, killing at will. And the center of Chechnya was Grozny. And this was one of my first experiences of real frontline war. And I was mesmerized by it and horrified in some ways. But if you're a TV journalist, watching war at first hand and close up is incredibly dramatic, and it gets your pulse rating, and it fills you with adrenaline, really, and you know that the images you're going to get are going to be kind of historic and momentous. And I wondered why I was feeling like that, and I still do now, because I'm very scared of lots of things. Like I would never go paragliding or never jump from a plane in a parachute. But at that time, and I was quite young, I didn't seem to mind going right into the middle of a war zone and getting shot at. And for example, I've had a few near-death experiences, and the first one was probably then. And we went into the center of Grozny during a ceasefire, what we thought was a ceasefire. Well, it was a lull in the fighting, and the Russian army had been pulverizing Grozny, this sort of rebel city in Chechnya, with everything they had, bombing it from the air. They'd been killing, a few journalists had been killed there. And anyway, we went into the city center, and we wanted to meet the rebel commander, and the rebels were in the presidential palace in a sort of basement. And we were just about to interview them, and then this new Russian onslaught started, and there were missiles coming into the building, and the rebels said, come in and take shelter with us. And I was thinking, I don't want to get trapped in here for the next 6 months or something. The choice was either to go in with the rebels or to run across the square to where our car was and to get out. And we did that. And I just remember bullets whizzing past my ears and thinking, God, please get me out of here. I've pushed my luck too far. And this was a feeling I often had, and I think other war correspondents have had that kind of feeling, that sometimes you just push your luck too far and you just really regret it. You want to get out of there. So I remember just sitting on the floor of the car when we were in the car and being driven out at high speed, having seen all these bullets and missiles flying around, and thinking about my kids actually, and thinking, God, get me out of here. And then, if you do get me out of here, I'll never do this again. And then, of course, you do it again and again and again. And the next time I really felt like that, I was in Zimbabwe. And I don't know if you remember, this was back in about 2000, so just over 20 years ago. And Robert Mugabe was doing basically a land grab from the white farmers. And it was a big story at the time because they were destroying white farms, taking them over, and often killing the white farmers. And it was very violent and very brutal, and burning their farmhouses down. And I'd been sent to Zimbabwe to cover this story. And I got there, and my producer there said, there's one thing we haven't done, and that's to be inside a white-owned farm when the Mugabe militants are actually taking it over. And I said, okay. I mean, sounds good, theoretically. Also sounds a bit dangerous. He said, yeah, but we've got this farmer, and he's really nice, and he's saying, you can film as they come in, but then you can get out after you've filmed, before they've actually come into the house, you'll be able to get out through the back. So there we were. We went, all was going fine. It was a big farm, and he had a front gate and a back gate. And he said, this farmer said, park the car at the back gate. They're going to come in. I know they're coming in because they've told me they're coming this morning, and they're going to take over my farm. So anyway, as they come in, you can film that and then get in the car, drive out the back gate. So I thought, fine, this nothing can go wrong. 200 of these Mugabe militants they were called the war veterans, and they turned up. And a lot of them sort of crazed on drugs. They had machetes, they had knives, some of them had guns. There was a mob of about 100 of them at the front gate, and then I realized to my horror, another 100 had gone to the back gate where our car was. So we were trapped for about 3 or 4 hours there, and they smashed through the fence, and then they came to the farmhouse, and they were smashing the windows, and they were saying to the farmer, sign this piece of paper, which basically signs away your farm to us. And I just remember sitting in the kitchen, we were cowering, thinking we were going to be chopped up into little pieces by these machetes, and saying to the farmer, why don't you just sign? And he was saying, I'm not signing that, I'm not signing my farm away. And we were saying, please, just sign. In the end, what happened was he pretended that we were relatives who were visiting from England. So he told us to hide our cameras in the wardrobes, and he lent us some suitcases stuffed with his clothes. And we got out, and I remember in those days we filmed everything on tape, and I put the tape of what we'd filmed in my underpants, drove out in a car, and we got away. But I do remember at the height of that thinking, I'm either going to die here or I'm going to win an award. And I literally went through my mind, and I did win an award, so that was handy. And then I think the other main sort of moment when I felt my life was really in danger was in Iraq, and I was with the British forces when they went into Iraq in 2003, which some of you might remember, the very controversial war over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the British troops sent in by Tony Blair. And I was embedded with the British Army, and we went in there. And I remember we'd filmed this battle for Basra, one of the big cities in the south. and we got some really good stuff. And there was one of Saddam's loyalists, one of his fighters, was dead on the ground, and with a rocket-propelled grenade, like just over there. And I was filming a piece to camera, and as I was filming, well, you know, when I report to the camera, and as I was filming this piece of camera, I just saw one of the British Army armoured vehicles just opening fire with big shells. And I turned round, and the guy who we thought was a dead body with an RPG had actually been pretending to be dead and had jumped up while my back was turned and was about to fire this RPG at me and my cameraman.
Goodness.
And the British soldiers had blown him away, and it was kind of weird to be involved in something like that. And we both shook the hand of the guy the British soldier who had shot him. I mean, not just shot him, but put a huge shell through his chest, actually. Not to be too graphic about it, but we shook the soldiers' hands. And I was thinking at the time, I was so relieved that I was still alive, because he'd saved my life effectively. But at the same time, we thought we'd crossed a line maybe, and why are we shaking a soldier's hand for killing somebody? And those are sort of conflicts of interest and thought processes that go through your mind. Being embedded, which is a way of covering war, I don't know if you know what that means, but it's when you basically, you're part of an army. So you sign up to their rules, you do what they tell you to, but you get greater access in response to that. So, for example, if you're with the British in Iraq, you know, you can't, they'll limit what you can see, they'll take you to places, they'll take you to front lines, you'll get more than you would do, and you're protected to a degree. It's still dangerous, but not as dangerous as if you're wandering around by yourself. And, but the deal is, there are some things you can report and some things you can't report. So, for example, the day before the British invasion in 2003, we were shown the entire British Army battle plan. I mean, I have to say it didn't mean very much to me, but it was huge maps on a wall, and the condition was, obviously, you don't broadcast that until we've actually done it. But we were given the battle plan. So there's a massive level of trust, because you're British reporters and it's the British Army. But then equally, there were times when, for example, we interviewed a guy from the RAF who was in Kuwait, who was going on bombing runs over Iraq, and I interviewed this RAF pilot and said, "What's your mission here?" And he said, "My mission is to kill people," which was quite brutal. And the press officer with the RAF said, "Well, obviously you can't use that." He just said he wants to kill people. And I said, "Well, he does want to kill people. Surely isn't that one?" And so there's a whole row about whether we could use that. We did use it in the end. But, you know, when you're embedded, there's, again, sort of conflicts of interest. They want you to say nice things about the British military. You don't always want to say nice things about the British military. And there was another one, too, with the Black Watch, which was a Scottish unit in Iraq. And it was very controversial at the time because Tony Blair had sent them into American-held territory, and people were wondering why he'd done it. Was it a political favour to George Bush? Anyway, I interviewed this Black Watch soldier, and I said to him, Tony Blair says you'll be home by Christmas. And he said, "Tony Blair tells lies." And again, I said, right, that's going in our piece tonight. And the British Army press officer said, "You can't possibly use that. He's just criticised the Prime Minister." I said, well, we're using it, and we did. So those are some of the thought processes that you go through as a war correspondent, whether you're embedded or not. But safety has, you know, of our journalists, and we have huge numbers of people, for example, now in Ukraine, and you've been probably watching them, where it's a lot safer, I would say, or our safety procedures are much higher. When I first started, there was almost no protection as a journalist. You did what you want, you went where you thought was best to go, for example, in Grozny or in Chechnya. It was down to you. Now we have safety advisors who are always ex-army, sometimes ex-SAS. They're kind of highly skilled military people, and they can advise you on the battlefield. And we're trained now, which we never used to be. We do a course called the Hostile Environments course, where it's quite a bizarre, Reeta, I'm sure, done it a few times, haven't you? And it's quite an extraordinary kind of training, because you go to a country house in the home counties of England, where they have big rolling gardens, and they turn it into a mini war zone. So they have minefields which blow up when you walk through them. You have people shooting at you. You go around in a Land Rover and you get kidnapped. And they throw a Hessian sack over your head, and then they make you, they said, the thing about if you're about to be executed is you have to beg for your life. You have to make eye contact with the commander. This is their top tip. And if you've got any pictures of your family, and especially your kids, that's ideal. So produce the pictures and say, look at my lovely children, you can't possibly shoot me. And anyway, so I did that, and then they shot me. But and we do a lot of first aid. So you have, it's very extravagantly done actually, and they bring in actors who go around. So you have like a mock refugee camp that's just been bombed, and you turn up, and there's all these people running around with, you know, no arms and no legs and spurting blood everywhere, fake blood everywhere, and you've got to do first aid and try to save them. But, you know, we do that every 3 years, and actually it really gives you a kind of confidence that if you are in a battlefield or something horribly goes wrong, you're better equipped to deal with it than otherwise you would have been. I mean, I actually I've never used it in a war zone, but I have used CPR just in London, actually. So it's a great thing. If anybody hasn't done first aid and is thinking of it, it's a really good thing to do. I also, after covering a lot of wars, and I think the sort of term war correspondent is a kind of weird term, because, I mean, who wants to be professionally covering wars? There happened to be a run of wars, I suppose, that I was covering in the 90s and early 2000s, Iraq, Afghanistan, various wars in Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, Somalia, the Balkans, Bosnia, Kosovo, Croatia. There just seemed to be war after war. Some smaller than others, but a lot of them, you know, pretty brutal. And so I sort of became a war correspondent by default, but I don't think it's a sort of title that anyone actually wants, and actually it's quite stressful to go through that life just doing dangerous assignments. I also did a lot of, and actually what I do remember, one of the weirdest things about having a family in London was that I remember covering a war in Burundi, and was particularly brutal, and traipsing around mass graves with, you know, lots of dead bodies in Africa. And then because of the miracles of modern flight, I was back later on that same day on a flight to London, and in the evening I was shopping in Sainsbury's in Fulham. And I always remember the absurdity of that, and it felt so strange. Not that, you know, some journalists like me who've seen quite a lot have had post-traumatic stress, and I've never had anything like that. I've had some bad dreams, but nothing terrible. But I do remember then feeling that was so disjointed, that kind of those two worlds, you know, where you go from absolute horror to doing the shopping in Sainsbury's and people complaining about the price of milk in Sainsbury's, and it's quite hard to get your head around. And what was also quite hard to get my head around was, you know, just at that time, having a family and a wife and kids in London, trying to juxtapose or combine those two lives, really, of being a dad and a husband in London, but also, you know, going off at the drop of a hat, you know, to horrible places around the world. And you get a call at 5 in the morning from the foreign desk saying there's a plane at 8 o'clock to Somalia or something, and you kind of think, oh, really? But, you know, part of you wants to go and do the story, and then part of you thinks, actually, I've got so many things planned. And I always remember we'd be invited to dinner parties, and the first time that you ring up and say, actually, I can't come, I'm really sorry, I can't come to next weekend's dinner party because I'm going off to Bosnia or Chechnya or something. And the first time, your host would say, oh, wow, that's so exciting. And the second time, you say, actually, I'm going to have to cancel again because I've got to go somewhere else. And they say, oh, all right. And then the third time, they just don't invite you, you know. So partly because of that reason, and my life felt like it was very chaotic and quite stressful, I went into presenting, like the lovely Reeta. And I was offered, this was back in 2006 actually, so I'd been on the road for about 20 years as a reporter. And I got an offer which was quite hard to resist because it was basically double the salary, no danger, and exchanging sort of war zones and horrible places for the warmth and safety and security of a studio. So what wasn't to like? And yeah, but then I did start that and it was quite terrifying, even more terrifying in some ways at first. I remember sitting in the studio and the red light came on and I hadn't ever been anchoring or newsreading before, and I was with Louise Minchin, who then went on to Breakfast News, and the red light came on and the director said, break this news, and I had no idea what he was talking about, and I was just looking vacantly at a red light camera and thinking, what breaking news? You haven't told me what it is. And he said, look at your screen, and I was, what? But of course you kind of get used to it, and I started, well, 24-hour news makes you do so much news, you do hours and hours, and it's a bit like pilot's hours, I suppose, in a plane where you get better and better and you get more and more used to doing things. And so I suppose I got more used to doing it and I got better at it. But having said that, there's always disasters, there's things that go wrong, and people always remember the things that go wrong. You can broadcast for thousands of hours, but they'll always remember the things that go wrong because people love that, especially nowadays with social media. So, for example, if you look me up online, there's a picture of me yawning in the studio. And so unfortunately, there was a piece playing about Palestinian refugee camps or something, and I wasn't yawning because I was bored by the piece, but I was yawning because I've been up in the newsroom since 5 o'clock that morning, and it was the end of a very long shift. And the director dropped his water bottle on the console in the gallery, which happened to hit a button, which happened to cut me up at the exact moment that I happened to be yawning. So, of course, this went super viral with memes of me as a lion roaring. And then I also, did a lot of anchoring from stories, which is quite fun because then you combine reporting and anchoring. So, the terror attacks around London, the Westminster Bridge, London Bridge attacks, the Manchester Arena, things like that. And you go to the scene and you report and you interview people. Those have their hazards as well because you're trying to introduce reports, do interviews, and keep the news channel going for hours, but standing in the street. And I remember doing the tuition fee demonstrations when they were really at their peak in central London, and they were quite violent. They were smashing up government buildings, and I was talking to the camera, and I'm thinking, this is going quite well actually. There's a lot of rioting going on, but I'm still presenting in the middle of this sort of rioting. Looks pretty good. I've got this nailed. As I was talking, I looked down and I realised one of the students had put a sticker on my lapel which said, "Fuck tuition fees." And I'd been standing there doing my bit for about 5 minutes. So these things happen. And then most recently, some difficult moments in the studio when Liz Truss resigned and I was doing the 1 o'clock news, which was, it's always, you get a buzz when there's a big story and it's quite thrilling actually. And I remember writing, because we write our stories, people often say, what do you do if you're a newsreader? You just come in, like my friends say, we get in at about sort of 8:30 in the morning for the meeting for the 1 o'clock news. My friends always say, well, why don't you get in at like 1:45? You just read the news. I say, well, actually we do talk to the team about what order we put the stories in. We write the story, we write the introductions, we think about who we're interviewing. So there's not just reading it out. Anyway, it's quite hard to get that across to some people, even your friends. But I had written these headlines about Liz Truss, and I said, Liz Truss on the brink of fighting for her survival. Some of her MPs say she's only got hours left in number 10, and had a message from the head of our Westminster operation saying that these headlines were way over the top and, ridiculously over the top. 5 minutes later, Liz Truss came out and resigned. So felt pretty good about that. And then, of course, when the Queen died, which was a huge moment and something that we all rehearse for all the time, had royal deaths. It's something that the BBC, people turn to the BBC and we kind of have to get right. So I was on, again, doing the 1 o'clock news. Hugh Edwards came in, kicked me out of the studio at 2 o'clock and actually announced the Queen's death later on that day. But I remember we'd had the medical bulletin about her saying that doctors were very concerned, but she was comfortable. And it was very hard to keep that going, and obviously that was all we were talking about. But for about an hour, I remember talking to Hugh Pym, our health editor, and all we could talk about was this statement. I mean, just poring over every single word of this statement, because all you have to do was stick to the facts and not anything else, because we didn't know how bad it was. They said she was comfortable. But equally, you can't start speculating, because that's not what we do. But you've still got to fill a lot of airtime. And I was getting messages from the gallery saying, you need to start looking back on her life. And I was thinking, but actually, do I? Is this, we don't know what her health condition really is. So I don't want to do an obituary. So you have to think in those big moments, you have to think about, because this will be, if you get this wrong, it'll be a disaster, and it's always going to be there. So those are very difficult moments, I think, and when being in the studio as opposed to being on the road is tough, and you earn your not inconsiderable salary. What I would say, though, is going back to what I started off with. I think news is incredibly important. Accurate news, accurate information in a democracy, and we're incredibly lucky to live in a democracy. And whenever I've been in places that are dictatorships, I sometimes think we take our democracy for granted. When I hear people say, "Oh, I can't be bothered to vote; they're all the same," I always think that's so complacent, because you have no idea of the horror of not living in a democracy. And I've got some Iranian friends, for example, who live here but can never go to Iran to see their family, because if they did, they'd be arrested, and their family can't come to them because they'd never go back. And the horrors of dictatorship, and we're seeing it with Russia now, are so apparent. And we're incredibly lucky to live in this democracy for all its faults. And I think a free media and a really accurate media is a crucial part of living in a democracy, and so we should cherish that. And I think the BBC has been, over the last 100 years or so, been a huge part of that. The media landscape is now becoming more and more fragmented, nobody doubts that, but we are still, I hope, and have been, a kind of standard bearer for all our faults, and we do have faults, I'm the first to admit that, and we get things wrong. And we have a lot of critics. But generally, we try to get things right. And I think what's been important in the media landscape is that we've had an influence on other excellent news outfits. So like Sky News, I think, is a brilliant news outfit. But they are partly brilliant because they've sort of modelled themselves on us and our impartiality. So have ITV News, which are also a first-class news outfit. And I think with TV media generally and radio, there's a lot of diversification now, it's true. But generally, it's accurate information. I have to say, the only time I've ever been really, well, not the only time, but one of the few times I've been written about in a newspaper, which was the Daily Mail. They got it not just wrong, but 100% wrong. And this is just leave you with this thought that don't always believe what you read in the papers. Well, definitely not the Daily Mail. They wrote a story, and it was quite bizarre. It said that the BBC's Ben Brown has called number 10 Downing Street. This was at the time of the Libya crisis, and David Cameron was in number 10, and there was military action against Gaddafi. BBC's Ben Brown has phoned David Cameron's chief advisor, Ed Llewellyn, and called for more bombing of Libya. And I had a call from the BBC press office saying, hi Ben, just wanted to double check this story the Mail are running, saying that you've called on the government to do more bombing of Libya. Just wondering why you'd do that. And I said, what? I don't know what you're talking about. And anyway, the Mail sort of apologised, and I think what had happened was I'd been interviewing William Hague, who was the Foreign Secretary, on the BBC, and I had said to him, some people are saying there should be more bombing of Libya. I don't know where it came from, but they said that I had telephoned Ed Llewellyn, who was Cameron's chief of staff. I didn't know him, haven't got his phone number, wouldn't know how to ring him, let alone call for more bombing. Anyway, it just gives you a clue as to what you can and can't believe. And we tend to think if things are in cold print, there must be a little bit of truth to them at least, but sometimes there really isn't. And that is quite scary in this sort of modern era when there's so much information flying around all over the place on social media and other media. So I suppose my message is, I think the BBC, for all its faults, and you're part of the BBC because you pay for it, whether you want to or not, and some of you probably don't. But I think we have been a real contributor to our democracy, and actually doing foreign news like I have done throughout my career, I think has been a great thing, because if you go to America and watch American television, I know America's a big country, but they do very little. It's like the rest of the world doesn't exist if you watch American TV news. And we've always reported around the world, and so have Sky and so have ITV News and our papers. So we're very lucky like that, and we should cherish that. And so, for example, when I was reporting from Ukraine on their Declaration of Independence in 1991, you might have said at the time, that's quite an obscure story. Who cares whether Ukraine's independent or not? But these things have a habit of coming back to have an impact on us, because we're quite a small world, really. And now, of course, the war, it has huge repercussions on all our lives. Gas prices, electricity prices. We need to know what's going on, not just in our country, but around the world, in lots of different countries. So that's why we prioritise. And some people will say, why are you doing all these foreign stories? They're boring. But actually, they might be foreign stories that have a part to play in your life. So I think the BBC is important. You'll miss us when we're gone, but keep paying the licence fee. And thank you very much. And I'm very happy to take any criticisms, questions, brickbats, whatever you want to throw my way.
Marvellous. Well, some hands going up already. So, Ben, can I just thank you first for a complete treasure trove of stories, some of them terrifying, I thought, all of them entertaining. And you just got across so much how exciting, exhilarating sometimes broadcast journalism is, and also how exposing it can be. The fuck the tuition fees sticker was, was nobody in the gallery watching to say to you, Ben, you've got a story. This is the...
They never are.
They never are, or no. It's such mayhem. Sometimes you feel with live 24-hour news that, you're just a second away from disaster, don't you? And you just about keep it on the air. So that I thought was very funny. Your what you said about the Queen and having to talk for hours and hours on the only information that you had that was in the public domain, while presumably, even if people didn't know, they did think that the news was that she had died, and how carefully calibrated you have to be, because you don't know when the palace is going to tell you. You know, even if you all know that she's died, you don't know if you're going to be told at 2 p.m. or at 6 p.m. And so you can't then pull out of that broadcasting and go to, you know, whatever it might be. And just one more thought about when you talked about coming back from a war zone and that sense of disconnection that you can have with life here. I mean, my career has been nothing like Ben's. It's been all very much on safe territory, apart from the time when I did go to Ukraine last year, so it was my only time in a country at war. And when I came back, so I was there for 2 weeks, and it was it's very intense, isn't it? All you do is work, and all you're just sort of immersed in this. And I came back, and my husband's in the audience, and he picked me up, and then we went back to the house, and the electrics had gone wrong, and the electrician was there, and it was like a parallel universe. But the one thing about Ukraine, I would say, is that it so absorbed everybody here right at the beginning, that in a way I felt that I was coming back to people who understood what I'd been to. So, you know, we went out for a walk that day, and there were kids selling cakes to raise money for Ukraine, and we went to a concert which was to raise money for Ukraine, and, you know, so on. So it was very pervasive, which made me feel less strange, I suppose. Yeah. All right, questions, and I know that there were a lot. If you just put your hands up. Right, okay. Let's start with the young lady down here, and then I'll come to you, sir. And do tell us your name and what you do, if it's pertinent, like, you know, if you're a media student or if you teach media, or, you know.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I work here at York St John. Thank you for your talk. It was really fascinating. One thing I noticed when you were talking is that behind these stories are these communities that both sort of enable what you do and could also inform your perspective. And I just wanted to know what that relationship is like. I suppose my question's in two parts. On a practical level, how do you find those people who will be there for you to help write that story? You know, how do you find a farmer who knows that his farm's going to be invaded the next morning for you to, you know, create that story? And then from a personal journalistic point of view, how aware are you of people's perspective and how that might colour your story or how that might influence your story? Yeah, thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah, good questions. Well, you hire, often in these places you have, for example, in Ukraine, we have a kind of basic sort of bureau now with some local fixers who are really across the story, who know all the local politicians, and we pay them. You know, they're not BBC staff, but we hire them because they're either translators or sort of fixers. We have drivers. So there's quite a lot of local staff, especially on a big running story like Ukraine, but even something like Zimbabwe there. You'd have some people there who know. In fact, with Zimbabwe, we had a very good local, a good BBC producer who's from Zimbabwe who had really good knowledge of people like that farmer. So you do have people on the ground, and of course that's a duty of care that you have, because sometimes you're putting them in harm's way, not just yourself. You've got your camera crew and producer that you're with. So when you're taking a risk, it's not just with your life, my life, it's with your producer, your camera crew, man or woman, and then the local driver that you've hired, you know, who you're maybe paying $100 or $200 a day to, but you're asking them to take you to potentially really dangerous places, so that's difficult, and your fixers as well, and translators. I mean, we've seen that with Afghanistan, you know, translators who work for the British Army and the British media. When the Taliban came back in, they were targeted, you know, and that makes you feel bad that people that maybe worked for me years ago in Afghanistan have been targeted as a result because they worked for the BBC, which is seen as an arm of the British state. And your question about what local people feel and how that colours your thinking, is that what you were asking about?
Yeah, and also, you talk to private individuals, but also public and state groups who facilitate, when you're with the military. I wonder what that relationship is like when you're writing a story, having someone.
Yeah. I mean, I think with the military, you're always, like I was trying to get across, you're quite sceptical. You're not just going to buy their line. You're not going to put over what they want you to put over. You want to be, obviously they're helping you if you're embedded. I think one of the things is, we talk a lot about impartiality. For example, you look at the war in Ukraine, me and Reeta, I'm sure both, feel huge sympathy for the people of Ukraine. I mean, they are incredible. I think they're incredible people. They're beautiful people. It breaks my heart what's happening. So I feel a deep kind of emotional empathy for them. So you could say, I'm not impartial. Well, I'm not impartial. I hate what Russia's doing in Ukraine. We don't say that on air. But you don't have to say, my feeling is you don't have to say that. It's obvious from what we're seeing and reporting. So there's no point in me standing there saying what Russian troops are doing here is vile and despicable. You don't need adjectives, you just need to. And we had that the same with Bosnia, I remember years ago, and we were all press corps in Sarajevo on the Bosnian Muslim side, and Sarajevo was being relentlessly besieged by the Serbs. And there was sort of pressure on us to sort of denounce the Serbs for that siege, and because it was cruel and they were killing little old ladies doing their shopping with sniper attacks. But again, I never felt you needed to, because you just needed to show it and say it. And we had a thing in Ukraine where one of our reporters did a piece to camera saying, in one of those places like Bucha outside Kyiv where there'd been atrocities by the Russians, and said the Russians claim this, but they're lying. And that was kind of controversial because it felt like a judgment. And they were kind of cross that was taken out of their piece, that reporter. But my feeling was, again, you don't really need to say it. It's kind of, you can show you show the report, show the facts, and these things should just be obvious to your viewers, really.
Yes, you can show that there is no evidence whatsoever that the Ukrainians did it to themselves. Look at, this is the situation. This is what, so you almost don't need that language. But it becomes almost slightly parliamentary. You know how politicians aren't meant to call each other liars. There's almost that sort of line, isn't there? Yes. I think is it the Lord Mayor?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ben, for that incredible presentation. I'm David Carr, the Lord Mayor of York. Not bragging, ladies and gentlemen. Well, a little bit. Ben, when you're on the front line and in a war zone, what sort of living conditions do you endure? You can't obviously go back to a 5-star hotel room every night, can you?
I always had a sort of motto when I was on the road a lot, that the better the hotel you're in, the worse the story. So if you're in a 5-star hotel, you're not really near the action. I think that some of the grimmest living conditions, I covered an earthquake in Pakistan, and I remember living in a one-man tent with my cameraman and sleeping every night, literally in a one-man tent, sort of snuggled up to my cameraman on some rubble from this earthquake, and thinking, God, what am I doing? But we were right by the story, and that was, and sometimes, especially with natural disasters, I covered the tsunami. In the tsunami in Banda Aceh in Indonesia, and there were just dead bodies. I mean, the death toll was staggering there in 2004, and there were bodies everywhere. And the only place we could find for the BBC to stay was a brothel. And all the prostitutes had gone, so we moved in. So sometimes you just sort of stay where you can, really. But if it's after an earthquake, if you think, do you want to be in a building after an earthquake where the walls are cracked and you think it might come down because there's an aftershock? So those are probably the most difficult living conditions. Weirdly, in Kyiv, that hotel is a really lovely hotel. There aren't many people staying in there at the moment, or there weren't when we were there. But it's got fantastic, relatively good facilities. But that's because Ukraine is a lovely country with lovely hotels, and so sometimes it's weird. Sometimes you can stay in a 5-star hotel and be in the centre of it. Sometimes you're in a little tent. But yeah, generally, if you're in a little tent, you're closer to the action, I would say.
We've had this case recently, a colleague of ours, Anna Foster, who's reported the Turkish earthquake, and she very famously drove there with a Turkish taxi driver who spoke very little English, and they shared his taxi to sleep in for a couple of nights, and she broadcast on her iPhone. So, you know, same sort of conditions, really. Is there anyone up there that wants to ask a question? I did promise that I would look up at you. No, not yet, anyway. Okay. Down here, yeah.
With the rise of misinformation, would you say it makes it harder to report when, sorry, I've got a stammer, when there's so many people seeing fake news stories, would you say it makes it harder to do your job?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was alluding to, I think. Just generally, there's so much kind of misinformation, which we sometimes do try to, and we now have a disinformation reporter, actually, who tries to sort of debunk some of the false information that is there, and false footage as well. So, for example, if you're trying to do a story like what's happening in Iran with the rebellion, you know, the uprising that there's been in Iran, and you're trying to verify the footage, because you can't be there, because the Iranians won't let you be there. So you're doing it all, it's not your eyewitness testimony, you're not filming it. So you're taking footage that people have filmed on their mobile phones or said they've filmed, and you've got to then, we have quite a strict sort of way of vetting all that sort of footage and the information in that footage. So our Persian service, who are very expert, have got ways of going through it, checking it is where it says it is, when it says it is. So those sort of stories are particularly hard to do when you're doing it sort of second-hand. But again, it's important that we get that right, because if you need to, if we get something wrong and we say, oh, there's been a massacre by Iranian security forces, and then it turns out it's actually footage from something completely different, then we're a laughing stock, and our credibility goes through the floor. So every mistake you make, I always think, you know, if ever I hate getting things wrong, you know, it's the one thing. It doesn't matter what else you do. If you get something wrong, you know, you're broadcasting this to millions of people, and it's wrong. And so, of course, everyone makes mistakes, and mistakes will happen. We can't, you know, we're a 24-hour news operation. There's always going to be some mistakes. But you know, you think every little mistake chips away at your credibility. So, for example, that story about the Daily Mail, hopefully that has chipped away at their credibility. But
there's also the role of social media, I suppose, isn't there, as well, that, you know, if you're broadcasting what you know to be true, or what you feel are the facts as you know them, if they're not to people's liking, they will not want to believe them. And we're subject to that a lot, aren't we? On some of the most innocuous, well, not innocuous things, but things that get people angry. So this latest, the problems that we're having at the moment with fruit and vegetables, and, you know, fruit and vegetable supplies. You know, I'm not the reporter, but I'm the person reading it out on the 1 o'clock news. And I've had some very snarky comments from people on social media saying that, oh, well, typical of the BBC, they just don't want to say the big B word, Brexit, that it's Brexit's fault. And our business correspondents who've brought the story to us have had abuse and vilification for saying for not saying that it's Brexit, for saying it's bad weather and supply chain problems. And Theo Leggett, who's one of our correspondents, has written a long reply actually on social media saying, look, this is how we came to the story. Please don't hurl abuse at us for reporting what we think to be true in a complicated situation. Yes, Brexit plays a part, but it's not the whole thing by any means. And it's not what people are telling us. That's what he said. It's not what the suppliers are telling us.
But at the same time, I know what you mean, and you get a lot in social media. People tend to be so black or white, and so they can't just ask the question or, you know, even criticise you. They have to sort of, you know, have a go and call you something horrible and say, you know, you're a moron, or worse. But at the same time, I actually don't mind feedback. You know, I kind of want feedback from viewers, and often on Twitter. So if I've done an interview, And you look on your Twitter feed and people will say, oh, you were too hard on that person, or you were too soft on that person. And I think, sometimes people have got a point. I mean, generally I find what people don't understand is, so for example, if I'm interviewing somebody from the SNP, I will always, or anyone, I'll always play the devil's advocate. That's just what we do. We challenge. You're not going to come into our studio or come on Zoom and we're just going to say, what would you like to say, like they used to do in the 1950s? What would you like to say, Prime Minister? Thank you very much. We're not going to do that. We're going to have a go at them. We're going to challenge them rigorously. And that's what people like Nick Robinson do every morning on the Today programme, Laura Koonsberg does. And that's kind of part of what I was saying about our democracy. That's why the media is very important, to hold our politicians to account and to test their policies, test their ideas very vigorously. But it's amazing how when people respond to an interview on Twitter or whatever, they don't kind of get that basic principle of the devil's advocate. So I try to reply and say, look, and I've had people saying, well, you're obviously a Tory because you were asking all those Tory questions. Well, actually, I was interviewing the Labour spokesman, so I'm putting what the Tories say about the Labour policies to them. It doesn't mean I'm a Tory. And one person said, yeah, but you've got a blue tie on today, so you must be. Well, I had a red tie on Monday, so does that mean I was Labour on Monday? But yeah, but you do have to explain yourself sometimes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm George. I'm a second-year film and TV student. My question is just in regards to your experience on the front lines. You mentioned, obviously, with the farmer. Do you think with the increased safety nowadays that you would still be able to do that today?
That's a very, very good question. And I have been frustrated at times by safety rules. Do you remember that hotel thing in Mumbai when they took over the hotel, the gunman took over the hotel? I was sent to cover that. And I remember Sky News were very close to the hotel and were getting good stuff. And we had a ruling from our safety people that we had to be at least 100 metres away because there were still gunmen in the hotel and they were occasionally firing shots out. So, it was a sort of live shooting scenario, as they say. But I felt kind of hamstrung by our safety rules. But that's always the tension because you kind of want to get the best pictures and the best story. That sometimes means taking risks. But then if you have safety advisors, generally it's often in their interest, or it's not usually in their interest to suggest you take lots of risks because they don't want you to get killed on their watch. I do remember I used to follow England football fans around a lot when they were, quite nasty and there were a lot of hooligans. And I was doing this tournament where they were creating a bit of a riot in Belgium. And we had a safety advisor, and I remember, and he was and we were following these hooligans who were smashing up some town. And we had the safety advisor who was holding back the cameraman at the same time as I was pushing forward the cameraman. Because I was trying to get the cameraman to film this stuff and the safety guy was pulling him back. So there is that kind of, tension. But yes, you're probably right. In Zimbabwe, they probably would have said, but we didn't have a safety guy, so I got an award. Yay.
There are 3 here in the middle. There we go, yes. 2 men and a woman.
Hi, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. Just picking up on that question 2 questions ago, and you're talking about the sort of the critical analysis of the news. Do you think there's any room to change the curriculum, whether it be secondary education or within universities? Because it seems to me a lot of the problem is people's ability to pick up on the Daily Mail and believe it, and there's that lack of critical thinking. I always use devil's advocate, and I say it quite a lot, but I'm always accused of sitting on the fence. But I just wonder whether we're lacking in secondary education and possibly university in that sort of critical thinking aspect.
Ooh, I don't know. I mean, there is certainly a debate, controversial territory about sort of no platforming in universities and stuff and free speech. I think people should say what they want but be challenged. I'm all for free debate, rigorous debate. I don't know.
I think that there is stuff going on. So this is about teaching people to recognise if a story is not credible, teaching them to be sceptical or teaching them. And there is research going on. I did something for this charity Media Action where there's research going on in Cambridge about actually sort of inoculating people against disinformation. I mean, using that sort of idea that you feed, I think they were getting a small pilot group of people and feeding them diluted forms of disinformation and thereby teaching them how to recognise, how to be sceptical and questions they should ask, and is this reliable? So I think that sort of stuff is in its sort of infancy, but maybe it'll grow.
The trouble with social media, I think, is people, I mean, it's been said a lot, but people are in their own echo chambers. So if you're sort of left-wing, you tend to follow left-wing people on social media and you get back the views that you hold yourself. So you're never really exposed to different kinds of views. And I think that's one of the real problems. You need to hear everyone's views, really, whether you agree with them or not.
And it's amplified, isn't it,
it's
on social?
amplified,
Because if you're left-wing, you would read The Guardian. If you're right-wing, you would read The Telegraph. It was always thus, but it's much bigger now. Yeah. Is the microphone just going along the row? Yeah. Yes, okay.
Hi, I'm Gemma. I'm a third-year student here in journalism. You mentioned right at the very start about news avoidance, and I did just do my dissertation on that. But in my research, I saw that the BBC was trying to adopt the user needs model so that all of their stories were not just update me, but keep me on trend and educate me, things like that. So I wondered, as a journalist, how would this new way of thinking kind of affect how you go about finding stories and presenting them to the public?
Blimey.
It's the new world, Ben.
I'm going to be honest and say I have no idea. No, I mean, we're trying, I think what I would say is we're definitely trying new ways of reaching people. That's one thing. And we've got a current push to be on TikTok is a big BBC thing, which is kind of controversial in itself because TikTok's quite controversial because some people think it's, got strong links with the Chinese state. So
it's been banned in certain countries and federal organisations,
So it's difficult, isn't it, trying to reach young people or different platforms, but you're not actually running that platform. And then I do think, for example, our news website, there's a lot of space to explain stories more. And I always think we take a huge amount, generally my bugbear is that we take a lot of knowledge for granted. Producers in our newsroom, like I remember they said, we interviewed somebody from UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which looks after and I said, well, you can't just say UNHCR, nobody knows what that means. And the producer said, well, of course they do. Everyone knows what UNHCR is. I said, no, literally, go out into the street now, interview 10 people. I guarantee you, if you're really lucky, one might, but most won't. And that happens all the time, don't you think? We take for granted.
Yes, we do.
And we don't explain stuff clearly enough, I think. And, we talk about, when we're doing budget stories, we talk about the OBR. We don't explain sometimes what the OBR is and all these things that we know because we're journalists and we read papers obsessively and, that's what we do. But the general public don't. And I think I always love watching Gogglebox because you get a great idea of, the great British public, and often when they're watching the news, they're chatting to themselves.
Yes.
And whenever I've been on it, they're just talking about my hair or my tie or my jacket.
It's all that matters.
Oh, he needs a haircut.
Are there any other hands? Yes, sorry, yes.
So when you make your news packages, say, is 1 o'clock different to the 10 o'clock news in terms of what you can report in terms of watershed and things like that? So say, do you have to film 2 packages rather than just have one that develops? And then sometimes when you're in the studio, do you already know what's in the packages? Have you already watched them, or do they sort of just come on whilst you're live and you've got to update what's happened, say if it's changed from 1 o'clock to 10 o'clock?
I mean, yes, so that's a very good question. We try to update during the day, so the 10 o'clock is not like the 1 o'clock. It used to, we used to work at Television Centre in Shepherd's Bush, and we're now in Oxford Circus at New Broadcasting House. But in the old days, there were huge silos between those programmes. In fact, they used to have stand-up rows, the 1 o'clock and the 6 o'clock and the 10 o'clock. So if something had been on the 1 o'clock, there was no way it would ever be on the 10 o'clock, however good it was, which was mad, really, and a huge waste of resources. So now we're much more sensible and collegiate, and we don't have, in fact, the 1 o'clock and 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock are part of the same sort of stable under the same editor. But obviously you do want to update stuff through the day, and you know, you don't really want, there's not usually a huge crossover, funnily enough, in terms of the audience. So not many people are watching the 10 o'clock who've seen the 1 or the 6 o'clock, generally, but you do try to update and try to bring in different pieces. Sometimes pieces, you know, really big piece from Ukraine might be held back for the 6 or the 10 o'clock because they're seen as more the flagship bulletins. Yes, we do, you know, if we're presenting, maybe we haven't seen everything, especially at 1 o'clock, because it's always a bit of a race to get that bulletin together, to be honest, which is why it's quite fun to do it, because you're always racing against time. But generally, you've hopefully know the gist of what's in the pieces. But you'd be amazed. I mean, the pieces are often not ready. The reason we haven't seen them is they're not ready until they go on air. So, for example, when we're presenting in the studio, quite often we're standing up reading the top introduction to the top piece, and in our ear, the director's saying, "We haven't got the piece yet, haven't got the piece.
Read it slowly.
Read slowly. They're still editing." And I'm thinking, this introduction's like, there's only another 10 seconds. I mean, they need to get on with this edit, you know. So you'd be amazed how, and when I was a reporter in the field, I mean, I wasn't the worst at this, but you always, you know, it's like if you're a student, you work to deadline. You know, if the essay's got to be in for 9 a.m. tomorrow, you work through the night until 9 a.m. to finish it. And it's a bit like reporters do the same, so they're always finessing the piece until the last minute. So a lot of pieces, you know, a feature piece would be ready well in advance, but a news piece, often the top piece, won't be ready until the last seconds sometimes. And then, of course, sometimes they don't make and they miss their slot, and then there's a big sort of post-mortem afterwards and the reporter gets a bollocking.
I am under strict instructions to finish at 5 to 6, and it is 5 to 6, but if you will hang around for a while and have a drink with us, then we can go on talking afterwards. But would everyone please say a huge, huge thank you to Ben Brown.
So Ben, on behalf of everyone here, I would like to express my warmest thanks to you. You've really given us some fascinating insights into life at BBC News. It's been a real pleasure to learn about your unique experiences, and it's really made me think a lot about how we interpret the world around us. I think now watching the BBC News will never be quite the same experience. I shall have a lot more insight into what's happening. So I would like to present you with a small token of our appreciation and wish you the very best for your future journalistic endeavours. So thank you very much.
That's very kind. You didn't need to. Thank you. You didn't need to, honestly. Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Very nice.
That's very nice.
So please do move back into the foyer and join us for a drink and some networking. Thank you.
Some networking.
Networking, exactly.